Hi, this is Tawny from the Dirty Bits podcast, and you're listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
Warning: this episode contains details of violent deaths, including the deaths of young children, that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Also, today's episode is the second part of a two-part series about the Twilight Zone movie disaster of 1982. If you haven't listened to part 1, I would suggest that you pause this episode and skip back to last week's and listen to part 1 first. Last week, I took you through the entire narrative of how the Twilight Zone movie came to be. We talked about the directors who got involved in the making of the thing. We talked about how the movie was going to be laid out, divided up into 4 segments. We talked about how each segment had its director and production crew. We focused on the one segment that was going to be directed by John Landis of Animal House, the Blues Brothers, and Michael Jackson's music video for Thriller fame. We talked about how Landis' segment had originally been scripted, as well as which early episode of The Twilight Zone from which it was inspired. And then we talked about the accident, the helicopter crash that took the lives of 3 people. The segment's main character, portrayed by veteran actor Vic Morrow, and 2 young children, Renee and Myca. We talked about how they ended up having to rewrite the film with an ending that fell flat with critics and audiences. And we also talked about how well the film was received once it was finally released. Today, we are going to get into the aftermath. I already told you last time that the accident, the worst on-set accident to ever happen, even to this day, all but severed the friendship between directors Steven Spielberg and John Landis. The two, to this day, haven't spoken. We're going to delve into what happened subsequent to this tragic event. This helicopter crash that killed Vic, Renee, and Myca had become a highly publicized event, unlike some of the set deaths that I had discussed last week. Studios usually like these things to quietly go away, but this accident was not going to be one of those. It had a great deal of media attention from the onset, and it just wasn't going to be that easy to make it go away. We're going to get into the criminal trial, the civil lawsuits, and how this event changed movie-making safety regulations forever in today's second part of California Dreaming, the tale of the Twilight Zone disaster. In July of 1983, nearly 1 year after the deadly accident that claimed the lives of 3 people, including 2 young children, John Landis, along with 4 others, associate producer George Folsey, production manager Dan Allingham, special effects coordinator Paul Stewart, and helicopter pilot Dorsey Wingo, found themselves seated in a Los Angeles courtroom as they intently listened to a grand jury indict them, accusing them of involuntary manslaughter, that they caused the deaths of Vic, Renee, and Myca. They all pleaded not guilty, Landis himself stating, "The accident was an overwhelming tragedy for many people. It had a profound impact on our lives. I know in my head, and I know in my heart, that we did not cause this accident." If convicted, Landis could be sentenced to 6 years in prison. However, if he were to be acquitted of the criminal charges, Landis would still be made to face 3 wrongful death lawsuits seeking millions in damages. Oh, and remember those child labor law violations I discussed in part 1? Well, as it turns out, at the time the accident happened at 2:30 in the morning, that was actually 8 hours past the legal curfew for the 2 children who were killed to have been allowed to be working on the set. Landis was fined $5,000 for that violation. The criminal trial, however, would not begin for another 3 years in 1986. They did need to wait for the final investigative report by the National Transportation Safety Board, or the NTSB, to be completed. And just in case you out there listening, particularly outside of the United States, according to its website, the National Transportation Safety Board is an independent federal agency charged by Congress with investigating every civil aviation accident in the United States and significant accidents in other modes of transportation: railroad, highway, marine, and pipeline. The NTSB determines the probable cause of accidents and issues safety recommendations aimed at preventing future accidents. In addition, the NTSB carries out special studies concerning transportation safety and coordinates the resources of the federal government and other organizations to provide assistance to victims and their family members impacted by major transportation disasters. I believe I stated earlier that Landis would be the first movie director in history to be criminally charged with a crime in connection to a death, or in this case, multiple deaths, on the set of a movie. It was also the first time that children were killed on a movie set as well. I think most of us, if not all of us, are on the same page when I say that this helicopter crash on the set of the Twilight Zone was an accident. I'm not really trying to split hairs about the director saying this or the pilot doing that or the special effects guy's timing was bad. It was just a perfect storm for something to go terribly wrong. And it was an accident. But for the first time, 5 people were being criminally charged. It raises the question, when does an accident become a crime? Nobody had ever been charged before because they're accidents. But there was something different about this particular accident. Maybe it was the gruesome nature of their deaths. Maybe it was because such young children were involved. I was even thinking that the fact that there were a number of violations going on at the time, that if Landis had been within the regulations, those children would have never even been there at that hour to begin with. Like I said, the perfect storm. When considering the law, there's a place where accidents do become a crime, and it's called criminally negligent homicide. Elsewhere around the world, it may be called gross negligent manslaughter or culpable homicide. This crime occurs when a death results from serious negligence or serious recklessness, and it is a high degree of negligence that is required to warrant criminal liability. So essentially, the individual or individuals being charged with criminally negligent homicide don't necessarily need to have been aware of the potential dangers of his or her actions. Manslaughter, in a sense, is considered accidental in that it indicates that harm, but not death, was intended. Whatever the case, determining the charge all depends on one major factor. What was the state of mind of the person who was being charged with the crime when the accident occurred? Not only that, in determining justice, the state of mind of the person after the killing can also be taken into account. Is there a sense of responsibility, reparation, atonement, sorrow? Is it sincere? Is it necessary to assign blame by levying charges? The case that came to mind right away in discussing the actions of a person who directly or indirectly caused the death of another person were the couple in episode 9 who had the dogs that mauled their neighbor to death. I had read a couple of articles online that clearly stated that if they hadn't acted so bizarrely in the media afterwards, if they hadn't been more concerned about the well-being of their dogs than they were about the well-being of the neighbor their dogs had mauled, and if they hadn't gone so far as to blame the neighbor for her own death, that the couple may not have ever faced charges at all. It would have all been chalked up to a tragic accident, and everyone would have gone on with their lives. But they were eventually charged with second-degree murder, an unprecedented charge in a case such as this. So, state of mind after the fact can bite you in the butt. And then there's intent. I don't think any of us think anyone on the set of the Twilight Zone movie had any intention whatsoever for something like this to have happened, of course. But that really doesn't mean much to lessen the devastation of these deaths. There are a couple of sayings about good intentions, right? Such as, the opposite of good is good intentions, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. When you set aside your better judgment, and you push boundaries, and you break rules, sometimes there are consequences. Bad ones, like this. Just because you didn't mean for this to happen, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be held responsible for it. But does it rise to the levels of criminal responsibility? Perhaps. On October 30th, 1984, more than 2 years after the deadly accident on the set of the Twilight Zone movie took the lives of 3 people, the National Transportation Safety Board attributed the crash to a communication failure between the director, John Landis, and the pilot, Dorsey Wingo. Its ruling reads as follows. The probable cause of the accident was the detonation of debris-laden high-temperature special effects explosions too near a low-flying helicopter, leading to foreign object damage to one rotor blade and delamination due to heat and the other rotor blade, the separation of the helicopter's tail rotor assembly, and the uncontrolled descent of the helicopter. The proximity of the helicopter to the special effects explosions was due to a failure to establish communications and coordination between the pilot, who was in command of the helicopter's operation, and the film director, who was in charge of filming operation. And with that, the NTSB laid blame upon the director and the pilot. 3 others would be made to answer to the charges that they acted with negligence on the set while filming that fateful scene, leading to the 3 deaths. The trial began in July of 1986, 4 years after the accident occurred. The 5 defendants from the Hollywood motion picture industry, all of which had pleaded not guilty, would be facing the charge of involuntary manslaughter in the deaths of Vic, Renee, and Myca. In the intervening 4 years, the film industry had reassessed all of the safety standards which govern filmmakers, as they had been taking more and more risks to get that perfect shot. I will talk about how the industry changed in the wake of the Twilight Zone disaster a little bit later. And what about John Landis? How had his career fared in the 4 years since he directed that chopper to go lower? He continued working pretty regularly, pretty much without skipping a beat in the time between the accident and the trial. He directed a handful of movies and sprinkled in some television shows and music videos. As a matter of fact, he was in the middle of directing Thriller when the accident occurred. You might be likely to think that this accident would have been a huge detriment to a director's career, and I will also get into that a little bit later. And I mean, from what I read, mostly everyone involved in the Twilight Zone struggled to find work in the years following. But seemingly Landis was doing okay. As a matter of fact, to most looking on, it appeared to be quite the opposite. His career seemed just as strong and dynamic as it had been prior to the accident. Landis had tremendous support of a lot of people in Hollywood. There were some exceptions like Steven Spielberg, but I don't know. He wasn't talking to the guy anymore. I don't know if he felt like Landis's actions rose to the levels of criminality, but as it were, most of Landis's peers, most of his colleagues felt criminal charges were not justified, that it was an accident, just like many before and many that would follow. No director would ever want something like this to happen on one of their sets. And many people did not feel this accident was a crime. But the Los Angeles County District Attorney and prosecutor would disagree. Of course, everyone in the film industry was keeping a close eye on this trial as it began to unfold. When Rolling Stone magazine wrote an article in 1984 examining the issue of the extent of responsibility of movie directors, a host of Hollywood directors spoke out in an open letter to the magazine defending Landis, including Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, John Huston, Sidney Lumet, Bill Wilder, and Fred Zinman. They insisted that directors perform only the artistic function of designing movies, and that they depend on the skills and professional responsibility of others involved in the production. For court watchers at the time, and from the looks of the cast of attorneys on both sides of the aisle, this case was going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight. The chief prosecutor was Leah DiAgostino, a deputy DA who had been given the nickname the Dragon Lady by her peers, as she appeared to be a quite elegant and sophisticated woman, but tended to be rather theatrical, sometimes over the top in the courtroom. But you know what? I don't think the same things would have been said or written about her if she had been a male prosecutor, actually. So I will not be referring to DiAgostino as the Dragon Lady, nor will I refer to her diminutive stature, as many articles back in the 80s seemed to do so. This woman was taking on 7 incredibly prominent defense attorneys Landis had stacked up to take her on, which was probably a smart move on his part, because from all accounts, District Attorney DiAgostino was tough. Doesn't this sound kind of like a little dream team a la O.J. Simpson-esque to you? I thought so too. Out of Landis's own dream team, the most prominent of his defense attorneys was a gentleman by the name of James Neal. He was a former Watergate prosecutor. One of the first things he did, along with co-counsel Harlan W. Braun, was to stand up and announce, "There is something terribly wrong here," he had told the judge. And Braun, standing up, pointing his finger at DiAgostino, exclaimed, "We will argue to the jury that the prosecutor is a liar," followed by an immediate request for a mistrial. They didn't just try this once, but several times, and each time she pushed forward, as she was determined to see Landis and the 4 defendants behind bars for involuntary manslaughter. All their attempts at a mistrial were denied, and if you ask me, it seems like these 7 men were the ones who were all about the theatrics. The courtroom confrontations between DiAgostino and the 7 defense attorneys garnered almost as much media attention as the actual accident had. And you can bet the courtroom dynamics between the defense and the prosecution were being watched closely, because, in a sense, Hollywood itself was on trial. Ever since the Twilight Zone accident, more and more allegations have arisen that some filmmakers had been sacrificing safety of the actors for years in order to achieve dangerous special effects. Regardless of the outcome of the case, there were certainly going to be changes made when it came to safety guidelines. The defense attorneys, after a while, began to sound like a group of bratty kids, saying things like D'Agostino was ignoring normal courtroom courtesies by forcing the defense to laboriously lay out a foundation for everything it wanted to present. In other words, they don't like the way she's making them do their job. Also said was, quote, she's turning the trial into an expression of her own ego, unquote. Another defense attorney stated, not only do we want our clients exonerated, we want to see her eat it too. That she's developed tunnel vision, that this case is consuming her life, and she was a win at any cost prosecutor. And what was her unmoved response? If they want to attack me personally, if that's the only way they can divert attention from the facts of the case, then they'll do it. I find it really amusing and flattering that 7 top, highly paid attorneys have to stoop to these tactics to get rid of Lea D'Agostino. You cannot dispute the facts that 3 people are dead, needlessly, for a motion picture. And there is no motion picture in the world worth 1 human life, let alone 3. Lead attorney Neal would say of D'Agostino, if the prosecutor kept her mouth shut, I would have kept my mouth shut. I've always believed that lawyers can fight each other in court and be friends. But I perceive an unrelieved animosity on the part of Ms. D'Agostino. In Neal, D'Agostino would face one of the toughest adversaries in her career, as she refers to him as the master puppeteer. Aside from his role as chief Watergate prosecutor, he also successfully prosecuted Jimmy Hoffa for Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and as a defense attorney, he gained acquittals for the Ford Motor Company in the case of the Pinto gas tank fires, and for Louisiana Governor Edwin Edwards in his racketeering trial. But this would be his first case involving the movie industry, and he seems to not be fazed by any of it at all. And in contrast, D'Agostino is a relative newcomer as an attorney. The victims of crimes of cases that she has prosecuted appreciated her sympathy and dedication to seeking justice for them, while defendants and their lawyers generally despise her. And Landis's septet of attorneys were no exception. It would be the contention of the prosecutor that Landis and his co-defendants engaged in conduct that was grossly negligent, that placed the lives of Vic, Renee, and Myca in an inherently dangerous situation, and that is what, in fact, resulted in their deaths. The case against him would also include allegations made by various witnesses on the set that Landis ordered the helicopter to descend to only 30 feet above a hut that he knew was going to be blown up, an accusation that Landis denied. The explosives expert, James Chamomile, the one who detonated the fatal blast, had been offered immunity in return for turning state's evidence and testifying against the defendants. Is the director, the captain of the ship, the one in charge of everything? Is he the one who's to be held responsible for everything that transpired? Would it only be his fault if he knew the children were on the set illegally? Which I do believe he did know, but it is still unknown how much he knew or didn't know about them being there. Can he be held responsible for wanting a helicopter to be flown lower, therefore directing it to be? Or is it that he put his faith in the pilot and the pyrotechnics expert to use their best judgment, that it was up to them to say, no, this is too dangerous? Landis was being accused for going for the lowest possible cost for everything when putting the production together. And that included a pilot with very little movie experience. And not only that, that Wingo was apparently one who would not talk back to the director and did what he was just told to do. It had also been noted in the investigation that a crucial radio link between the director, the special effects expert, and the pilot was lousy. Witnesses who were on the set would testify that Landis appeared to be irritated and impatient, yelling obscenities at the pilot over the radio. The contention was that he was under pressure because the production was reportedly behind schedule. As a result, under a tremendous amount of stress, Landis was somewhat volatile. A camera operator testified that Landis was a tyrannical filmmaker who seemingly felt no responsibility for the people he placed in a very dangerous Vietnam War scene that led to the 3 deaths. He stated, "While I was there, I had no sense whatsoever that the people who were running the operation had any sense of care or sense of responsibility for anyone involved, whether it be actors, crew, or bystanders." He testified that Mr. Landis was a yeller and a screamer on the movie set, and that on more than 50 occasions gave orders to his crew over a walkie-talkie in a voice so loud that his words became distorted as they came through on the other end, stating he was giving orders, things like, no, this is going too slow, that's not the right place, nuts and bolts type of orders. The cameraman, the one who filmed the fatal scene from atop a cliff, stated that he thought it would be very dangerous because of the explosions, stating, "Whenever you have explosions, there is danger involved. This one had lots of explosions. Therefore, the danger was increased. And whenever you work around a helicopter, there is always danger involved." He continued, saying, "In this case, you had explosions and a helicopter, plus the fact that you had actors working very close to the helicopter and to the explosions. All of that increases the danger. Because of all of this, I felt it was very dangerous, with all of those variables, all of those potential hazards there." He also would testify that he believed Mr. Landis had behaved in an irresponsible manner for purportedly rushing the fatal scene, and even stated that as a cameraman, he even feared for his own safety, as he had expressed his concerns to a special effects expert that a fireball from an explosion could reach his position on top of that cliff. The expert replied, "Are you going to be up there? Well, I hope your insurance is paid up," as he did affirm that the fireball would indeed reach that high, which it had. Then the testimony came from the parents of Renee and Myca. Mark Chen, the father of 6-year-old Renee, testified that he had not been told his daughter would be filmed in close proximity to explosives or beneath a hovering helicopter. He explained that his brother was a friend of the husband of the production secretary for the movie, and he approached him in July of 1982 about the possibility of his daughter appearing in the movie. He testified that during his first meeting with the associate producer, that he was told that his daughter would be carried across a river by an actor. He stated that Landis approved of hiring his daughter, along with Myca, who were to appear in the scene, by looking them over on the set and saying, "It's good, it's fine." And that was the entire hiring process. Renee's father also testified that the children returned for filming and that they were accompanied by their parents, but the scene had to be filmed several times because the children kept giggling. So the parents were told that the children would have to be brought back for another night of filming because of it. He was told it would all be very simple, and that it wouldn't be necessary for him to accompany his daughter during the filming of the scene, which would be shot sometime after midnight on the evening of July 23rd, 1982. He testified that he and his wife were given $500 in cash and were told that they would be paid more when they returned. Mark Chen began to cry on the witness stand when he recounted his final visit to the set where his daughter was to be filmed. After a long wait for the scene to start, he said that someone from the filming company came to get the children from the trailer where the family had been sleeping, and that was the last time he saw his daughter. Daniel Lee, the father of 7-year-old Myca, testified that he was horrified when he heard the first explosion. He said that he fell on the ground because he was so horrified, and that the next thing he saw was running, pushing, and shoving. And then he saw the body of his son. He also echoed the testimony of Renee's father, that they were not told their children would be in close proximity to explosives, or that they would be under a hovering helicopter, and that he heard Landis demand the helicopter to fly lower. And then came the testimony of the moms. Myca's mom and Renee's mom both took the stand to recount the tragedy that took the lives of their young children, the tragedy they helplessly watched unfold right before their eyes. Cheyenne Chen broke down in tears as she testified how she watched her 6-year-old daughter Renee, her only child, die on the Twilight Zone movie set after having been reassured that the children were absolutely in no danger. Through her tears, she said, "I saw a helicopter fall down, and many fire sparks, also noise. Barely louder than a whisper, and speaking in Mandarin Chinese, she testified through an interpreter how she had asked the filmmakers whether Renee was in any danger, and that she was told she was not. She was asked if she had been told that a helicopter would be flying closely over the children, and she said no. She too testified that they were not told that there would be explosives. She testified about what happened on the set after special effects explosions began going off on the set and before the helicopter crashed, saying that there was some water that had splashed in Renee's eyes and that she was crying because she had dust in her eye. Then she said she saw Mr. Landis go over to Renee and pick up the crying child. That's when she asked the associate producer if this was dangerous, and he assured her, "No, it's not dangerous. It's only noise." She testified that he warned her that if the fire inspectors came on the set, that she was to tell them that she was a friend helping out and not to say anything about the money. She gave her testimony to a completely silent courtroom. Not a sound from the gallery. Her answers were slow, and the pain and the emotional torment were palpable. The group of attorneys for the defendants decided as a whole that none of them would be asking any questions on cross-examination. After Renee's mom left the courtroom, there was a recess. Landis gathered outside with reporters around him and made a statement. "I can think of nothing worse than losing your child, and our hearts go out to the families of Renee Chen, Myca Lee, and Vic Morrow. It is a horrendous thing. If anyone thought such a thing could have happened, we would have stopped. This is a terrible, terrible accident that will obviously cause pain and anguish to all of us for the rest of our lives. I can't think of what else to add." These were Landis's first comments since the commencement of the trial. Hua Lee, the mother of 7-year-old Myca, also took the stand during the trial. She testified that the associate producer told her that he would treat her child as his own, but also testified that she was never told by either him nor Landis that her child would be near explosives, or that her son would be filmed underneath the helicopter that would later crash on top of him, the other child, and Vic. Welling up with tears, she also testified that she was never told that her son was being filmed illegally after dark without work permits. All she was told was that if they were to hire her son, that it would be a scene about a Vietnamese village that is bombed and destroyed, that only 2 children would survive, and that Vic Morrow would pick up the 2 children and run across the river. What's more is that the associate producer led her to believe that in the movie, the Vietnamese village would have already been bombed and destroyed before the children were to be on the set. She said that he looked at Landis and at the producer and said, "We hire them." She said that she and her son were driven to the film set by a movie driver the day before the fatal crash. She testified that she was also told by the associate producer on the day of the fatal crash that she didn't have to come back to the set, that he would just pick them up, and he promised her that he would treat their children as his own. At about 2 a.m. the next morning, she testified that the producer came to the trailer they were sleeping in to take the children to the village scene. She said that they wanted to take the children without the parents, but she insisted on going along. She stated that Landis repeatedly filmed the scene with Vic and the 2 children without any explosives or a helicopter, that Myca and Renee kept laughing and giggling, and that Mr. Landis told them to try not to laugh and giggle too much. By about 4 a.m., she was told that they would not be able to complete the scene at that time, that the sun was going to rise soon. She was asked to bring her son back to the set later that day, but she said she was too tired. The producer offered to have a driver bring her son there and back, and promised he would treat him as his own, to which she agreed. She never saw her son alive again. She was paid $500 cash for the use of her son on the set of that movie. After 5 months and 71 prosecution witnesses, in a dramatic move, Landis himself would be the first defense witness to take the stand in his involuntary manslaughter trial. He disputed the testimony of every single witness that took the stand, including the testimony of the moms and dads of Myca and Renee. He did acknowledge to the jury that he had, in fact, illegally hired the 2 child actors who, along with Vic, were struck and killed by the crippled helicopter. But he added that he never realized that the war scene with the explosives would cause a fireball that would hit the aircraft, causing it to spin out of control and go down. As he stated, he never realized the danger. When asked what he had explained to the parents of Myca and Renee in terms of what their part of the filming of the movie would entail, he testified that he told them the whole story of this segment, which directly contradicts the testimony of all 4 parents. He did add that he did not personally inform the parents that the film crew did not have a necessary state permit to employ the children, stating that he directed the associate producer, and now co-defendant, to do so. He explained that because the state labor commissioner would not issue a permit for late-night filming of children, not because of the fears of filming would be dangerous, that they decided to break the law. He acknowledged that they knowingly decided to wrongly violate the child labor law. His attorney asked, "Do you recognize, John, that was wrong?" "Yes," Landis replied. During his testimony, Landis attempted to counter prosecution witness testimony, including the parents, a casting director, and the camera operator. The casting director had testified that when Landis described the Vietnam battle scene to her a month before filming, she told him that it kind of sounded dangerous to her. When asked if she had made such a statement, Landis replied, "Absolutely not." A camera operator testified that Landis said to him that we may lose the helicopter, and again, Landis denied making those statements as well. He did acknowledge that he was talked to about perhaps using dummies or little people instead of the children, but it was never about an issue of safety. The assistant director never complained about it directly to Landis because everyone was intimidated by him. He repeatedly defended himself, maintaining that he held many meetings on the set with members of his crew in which safety concerns were addressed. The prosecutor kept accusing Landis of the opposite, that this accident was caused in large part by a lack of planning and coordination. Outside the courtroom following Landis's testimony, Prosecutor DiAgostino stated, "If he's telling the truth, then so far, at least 19 other people are lying. The whole world is lying except for John Landis." Up next, she would have a crack at him. And I will get into the cross-examination after a short word from our sponsor, Blubrry. Creating a podcast is not as easy as recording your show and uploading an MP3. There is so much involved with it, so in order to get the most out of your show, you're going to need additional services, such as fast and reliable hosting, accurate download stats, an easy-to-set-up webpage that removes all of the pain points and just allows you to focus your time and effort on creating your amazing content. Blubrry, that's Blubrry, offers an array of products, from the simplest media hosting all the way up to a fully integrated WordPress site with their PowerPress Deluxe sites. If you already have a podcast up and running, or if you've been dreaming about starting your own, head on over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream, sign your show up, and get your first month for free. Yeah, I said free. The Blubrry support team is ready and willing to help you migrate your existing show with their free tools and without losing any of your subscribers. Take your podcast to the next level today with Blubrry and get your first month for free using the promo code DREAM. And now, back to the show. In a very tense, very emotional cross-examination, Landis insisted that he had no reason to believe that the filming sequence in which Vic, Renee, and Myca were killed would prove to be dangerous. His voice, shaky, sometimes breaking, he described the tragedy to the court when questioned by Prosecutor DiAgostino. But he stuck to his story that more than a dozen prosecution witnesses gave untruthful testimony when they insisted that he was forewarned of the danger of the Vietnam battle scene he was putting together. He stated, "I think it is very easy, after an accident, to make pronouncements about how things should or should not have been done. I think it's simple in hindsight to make vast and broad statements that ultimately are self-serving and puts yourself in a good light." In a blistering cross-examination, DiAgostino cited a long list of witnesses whose testimony Landis had contradicted: camera operators, the casting director, the production secretary, a photographer, fire safety officers, and even the children's own parents, stating, "I find it somewhat incredible. Why would these people manufacture this evidence?" She peppered him with questions vigorously, asking him whether or not he was putting on an act on the stand when he began sniffling and speaking with abbreviated pauses during his direct examination by his attorney. When addressing the media following her cross-examination, DiAgostino said, "It was a perfectly orchestrated script. Just the right amount of hesitancy, just the right amount of looking down, the right amount of looking at the jury, too. I frankly wish I had an Oscar I could have given him. If you're not crying when the parents of the children were sobbing their hearts out on the witness stand, then I don't know what other time you would cry." She did her best to drive home her point to the jury. During the cross-examination, Landis seemingly was able to maintain his composure, succinctly responding to the peppering of questions DiAgostino was throwing at him in a relatively rapid-fire manner. She was described by some, sitting in the gallery, as coming across like an irate mother scolding her son who messed up pretty bad. But Landis stood firm, reiterating over and over that no one told him that the proposed Vietnam War scene was dangerous. The prosecutor shot back, "Did you, Mr. Landis, need anyone to tell you that?" His answer, "Yes. If my own common sense was allowing something to take place that I had no expertise in, I would expect someone to tell me, no, that's dangerous. D'Agostino came right back at him. Do you feel you need expertise to decide that it is dangerous to place human beings that close to explosives going 150 feet in the air, 24 feet under a helicopter? Yes, he stated. She responded in an almost what sounded like rhetorical question. What type of expertise do you feel you need? Landis answered, I did not think having those three things in combination was dangerous in and of itself. Later again, outside the court to the media, D'Agostino said, You don't have to be a John Landis. I don't think you have to be anyone other than a human being with an ounce of common sense to understand that that is dangerous. For Landis to sit up there with a perfectly straight face and say that the thought never occurred to him is the most incredible thing of anything that he has said. Also in his testimony, Landis again reiterated that despite what the tearful, devastated parents said on the witness stand, he insisted he told the children's parents the story of the proposed film sequence. But he did admit that he did not tell them how large the explosions were going to be or how close in proximity the children would be to the explosions. Landis also, during his testimony, proceeded to run the gamut of denials regarding the things attributed to him from previous witnesses. He denied telling the camera operator, who allegedly warned him of the danger, that we may lose a helicopter. He denied jokingly commenting, we are all going to jail for illegally hiring the children. He denied curtly telling the casting director, to hell with you, we'll get them, meaning the child actors, off the streets ourselves. He denied ordering the helicopter to go lower, lower, lower at the start of the fatal scene, and this was a statement attributed to him by several of the 71 prosecution witnesses. Towards the end of Landis's 4-day on the witness stand, the prosecutor pointed out to him that he could have used various techniques of illusion to create a scene involving a helicopter and explosions without placing people in harm's way. Again, Landis insisted that he believed it to be safe. D'Agostino responded, So, if you felt the scene was not dangerous, you would have no hesitancy doing it again? He replied, I would not film it again. I'm sorry. 3 people died closer to me than you are, and I'm not emotionally prepared for that. I would not film it again. On May 29, 1987, John Landis and his 4 associates and co-defendants on trial for charges related to the deaths of actor Vic Morrow and child actors Renee Chen and Myca were all acquitted on all counts. It took the jury 9 days to reach the decision in the arduous 10-month-long trial, and when it was all done, and the judge turned to the 5 defendants and their attorneys and said, The defendants are discharged, the court erupted in applause. For 10 months the jury had been together. However, they were not sequestered. When the trial was over, many of them embraced and grinned, and soon the now acquitted former defendants, their wives, and their attorneys were first brought into a private meeting room. Then they all met together with reporters. They exchanged pleasantries and hugs with the members of the jury, everyone jubilant over the end of the long trial. In a discussion with reporters, the jurors indicated that the reason why they voted to acquit was because the prosecutor was unable to prove that anyone could have foreseen the crash of the helicopter that night, that it was an unforeseeable accident, and you don't prosecute people for unforeseeable accidents, according to the jury foreperson. Some of the jurors indicated that the defendants were not more culpable than others on the set, including the fire safety officials and the special effects expert who testified that he had set off some explosions too early, yet neither of them were charged. And if you remember, The special effects expert was given immunity for his testimony. When asked if being in awe of the movie industry had influenced the jurors' decisions, the foreperson stated, "Why should it? We're all from here, and Hollywood is just a part of our hometown." Outside the court, Landis told reporters, "I'm obviously relieved," as he hugged his wife, struggling to hold back tears, and he continued saying, "A truly terrible, tragic accident happened on the set of The Twilight Zone. That doesn't change that. I'm grateful to the jury." To the media, the prosecutor, who fought bitterly to try to win the conviction, told the media a more appropriate charge for Landis would have been second-degree murder. And of the verdict, she said, "I'm shocked, appalled, and disappointed." Back in December of 1983, Vic Morrow's 2 daughters had won a settlement for a lawsuit they brought against Warner Brothers Studios, along with others involved in the helicopter crash that killed their dad. They had accepted an out-of-court settlement of the suit, which claimed negligence and wrongful death against the studio, John Landis, the helicopter pilot, among others involved in the filming of the movie. It was reported by anonymous sources that the 2 sides agreed Vic's daughters would be paid $850,000 without an admission of wrongdoing. And just days after the acquittal, an agreement was reached in the civil lawsuits filed against John Landis and his former co-defendants, Warner Brothers Studios, Steven Spielberg, and the manufacturer of the helicopter by the parents of Myca and Renee. Although attorneys in the civil cases said they could not confirm any settlements publicly because of a gag order imposed by a Los Angeles Superior Court judge, a source did indicate that a firm agreement was reached to settle the case for approximately $2 million for each family. When the lawsuits were initially filed, the families were seeking damages of more than $200 million from the defendants. So what about life after the Twilight Zone tragedy, trial, and acquittal? Well, prosecutor DeAgostino was disparaged for her handling of the Twilight Zone trial and losing it. 1 year after the trial, she made an unsuccessful attempt to unseat her boss, Ira Reiner, for district attorney, an opponent she described during her campaign as being like a beautifully wrapped box. It looks good, it sounds good, but it's empty inside. A review of the first of several books written about the Twilight Zone case heavily criticized DeAgostino, stating that the trial was badly bungled by the prosecutor, who used it as a tool for self-promotion, a sentiment that proved damaging to her as a candidate for office. She had turned that nickname Dragon Lady around and used it as she campaigned for DA. Who better than a dragon lady to breathe fire on the war on crime? And remember, this is the year of the dragon. She actually didn't get the nickname from the Twilight Zone case. It had been given to her before by a defendant by the name of Muharrem Kurbegovic, also known as the Alphabet Bomber, who killed 3 people and injured 36 when he detonated a bomb at the Los Angeles International Airport in 1974. With that case, she would become the first female prosecutor in Los Angeles County to put a murderer on death row. And as for John Landis, it looked as though he was going to walk away from the 1982 helicopter accident and the subsequent manslaughter trial unscathed. I mean, in the year following the trial, he hit back with one of the biggest movies of his career, Coming to America, starring Eddie Murphy. But whether or not the accident had an adverse effect on his career would depend on who you're talking to, or even how you're looking at it. There are many articles that make the claim that his career was not significantly affected by the incident. He did finish the Twilight Zone movie. He had directed several hit movies later in the 1980s. But if you were to really focus in on his career as a whole, it would seem that it didn't take the hit right away, But the Twilight Zone debacle definitely dealt his career a serious blow, one from which he arguably would never recover from. Taking a look at his filmography, the work for which he is most famous would have been completed prior to the Twilight Zone, and after that, his successes would have been also completed prior to his manslaughter trial, which happened in 1986. He might have been able to walk away from the Twilight Zone with his career intact if the accident had only resulted in some confidential wrongful death lawsuits and some fines for violating child labor laws. Hollywood isn't likely to turn its back on those black marks on your record as long as there is box office success. But despite the fact that he was acquitted, a portrait of him was painted that portrayed him as an arrogant, uncaring, and out-of-control director. Not to mention his testimony under oath was directly in contrast to the testimony of dozens of witnesses, which means either all of them were lying or he was lying. But following the trial, Hollywood started looking at Landis as more of a liability. Filmmaking is a business, and John Landis meant that you had to take a chance on him, and studios really wanted to keep their distance. As I stated, he directed 1988's Coming to America, which was a huge hit. But after that, he would only ever work on one more major film, Beverly Hills Cop 3 in 1994, which was a box office and critical disappointment. But both of those movies were handed to him by Eddie Murphy himself, who had formerly directed him in Trading Places. Outside of Eddie Murphy, nobody was giving Landis anything noteworthy. By the early 1990s, the movies directed by Landis were lower budget comedy, horror, and documentary work. He had some flops, and aside from that, he really had no real work in movies other than as a producer and smaller involvement in other people's movies. That might, on the surface, appear to be a pretty decent living for a director, especially in the business of Hollywood. But when you put it into perspective, at the time of the Twilight Zone movie, Landis was only 31 years old, and he was already one of the most sought-after directors around, rubbing elbows with the likes of Spielberg. There was no reason Landis's career should have taken the kind of drop-off that he's experienced post-Twilight Zone. There is no reason that he shouldn't be making major studio productions even today, as many of his peers continue to do so. But it is quite evident that he simply is not. I mean, a director who is known for some of the most acclaimed and successful films of the 70s and 80s should have his pick of projects. Even with a few box office letdowns, that shouldn't have meant a transition to low-budget television and B-movie work. But when you break it down into two eras of his career, pre-Twilight Zone and post-Twilight Zone, it's clear that the tragedy did indeed have an impact upon his career that he would never really be able to recover from. He's managed to fare relatively comfortably, though, I'm certain of that. But unlike the families of Vic, Myca, and Renee, his life wasn't completely destroyed. One of the aspects of this story, in the time following the trial, kind of bothered me. And I don't know if when I tell you this part, if it's going to rub you the wrong way like it did me, but a little more than a year after Landis was acquitted on the manslaughter charges, the jury that found him not guilty was personally invited by Landis to a special screening party at Paramount Studios of his new movie, Coming to America, and they were told to bring as many guests as they wanted. The invite was extended to all 12 jurors and the 4 alternates. Even 2 members of the defense team publicly stated that Landis's invite left a bad taste in their mouth. Essentially, the case had been resolved from a criminal standpoint, but from a moral standpoint, that issue never really had been resolved. Landis never stood before the families of Vic, Renee, or Myca and took responsibilities for their deaths. And people were wondering, did Landis invite the Morrows, Chens, and Lees to the exclusive screening too? Weren't they a part of the case as well? And what did Prosecutor D'Agostino have to say about it when questioned by the media? She stated, "I think the jurors would have probably preferred to have been invited to the party he threw for himself to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the verdict, rather than a screening of a movie that I understand is not very good." So, as awful as the accident that occurred on the set of The Twilight Zone back in 1982 was, there was some good that did come of it. Warner Brothers immediately set in motion a complete overhaul of the movie industry's approach to safety on the set. A committee was assembled that developed a set of standards for every single aspect of filmmaking, including gunfire, fixed-wing aircraft, special effects, and pyrotechnics and smoke effects. Every motion picture guild and union in the industry was represented. The committee took everyone's input and collected them into a group of industry standards called safety bulletins. All the studios were then required to issue a manual to each of their employees based on the bulletins, known as the Injury and Illness Prevention Program. The guidelines are regularly updated and are now digitized, and the current versions can be viewed online. It was by no means a speedy process, however, and the standards constantly need to be updated. And despite all of the efforts in the world to improve safety, accidents continued to happen, tragic ones. Veteran pilot Art Scholl was killed when his plane went into a flat spin stunt maneuver that he was unable to recover from and ultimately crashed into the Pacific Ocean during the filming of Top Gun. That movie, if you've seen it and noticed, is dedicated to him. Stuntman Reed Rendell was killed in a helicopter crash on the set of Airwolf. And actors Brandon Lee, who I mentioned in part 1, and John Eric Hexum, star of the NBC series Voyagers, were killed by guns on the set that were supposed to be loaded with blanks. And after every mishap, new safety bulletins are issued. For example, when stuntman Dar Robinson died in a remote filming location after rupturing his spleen in a stunt during the filming of $1 Million Mystery, it became mandatory for an ambulance to be present on the sets at all times. Also, prior to the Twilight Zone accident, insurance companies didn't look at the movie business as a source of profit because film sets were simply too unsafe and the likelihood of a payout was just too high. After the Twilight Zone, and the industry's new renewed commitment to improving safety, along with increased budgets for insurance carriers, it made Hollywood a better risk, and soon more affordable rates to underwrite shoots became a part of the movie-making business. And that meant the industry had to abide by the demands of the insurance companies. Insurance companies want to know everything about the movie. They want to know the background of everyone working on the film. They want to see licenses. They want to see permits. They want to see materials, how many people are working on the set, the distances they will be from explosives, right down to how many fire extinguishers there are. Then the fire department has to come along with a list of safety criteria that needs to be checked off. And it keeps filmmakers responsible for everything before they can be covered. And of course, we can't forget that in today's world, the rise of computer-generated imagery has taken much of the danger out of stunts, especially the special effects stuff that requires explosions and pyrotechnics. And with all the safety standards now in place, hopefully what happened to Vic, Renee, and Myca more than 35 years ago will never happen again, especially as Warner Brothers is currently entertaining the idea of mounting another remake of The Twilight Zone. And one last thing before I end this story. Remember I told you early on in part 1 that there was indeed a criminal prosecution related to a death during the filming of a movie? John Landis and his associates were the first to be criminally charged in relation to deaths on a movie set, but they were not convicted. The one conviction came in 2014, on the first day of filming of Midnight Rider, the Greg Allman story. The crew was on an active railroad trestle, filming a dream sequence in which actor William Hurt would be laying on a bed on the train tracks. A warning was given to everyone that if they heard an approaching train, they had 60 seconds to make a run for it. So when the horn of the train blew, everyone dropped everything to get off the trestle. Some of the crew were trying to get the bed off the tracks in order to prevent a derailment, but they were unable to do so and had to abandon the bed on the tracks. Camera assistant Sarah Jones tried to make her way off the tracks as well, but she was lugging 2 huge bags full of expensive camera equipment, and the bed was still in her way. So when the train struck the bed, it knocked her directly into the path of the train, killing her instantly and injuring 7 others. The director, the producer, the executive producer, and the first assistant director were charged with involuntary manslaughter and criminal trespass. The director pled guilty and received a 10-year sentence, 2 years of incarceration, 8 years of probation. And the producer also received a plea deal and was sentenced up to 10 years of probation, and the charges against the other 2 were dropped. Unlike Landis, in the accident that occurred in 1982, director Randall Miller publicly accepted responsibility for the accident. His full statement reads as follows. On February 20th, 2014, a great number of mistakes were made, and the terrible accident occurred, which took Sarah Jones's life. It was a horrible tragedy that will haunt me forever. Although I relied on my team, it is ultimately my responsibility, and it was my decision to shoot the scripted scene that caused this tragedy. I pleaded guilty for 3 reasons. First, to protect my wife and family. Second, out of respect for the Jones family and not to put them through a difficult trial. And third, to take responsibility for my failure in not knowing that every safety measure was in place. The location manager, the production designer, the unit production manager, the cinematographer, assistant director, and all others all made mistakes that led to this. But I have taken responsibility because I could have asked more questions, and I was the one in charge. I have worked in the film industry as a director for 25 years and never had a significant accident of any kind on one of my sets. I am heartbroken over this. I hope my actions have spared the Jones family more anguish, and that the on-set safety measures that were lacking before this terrible tragedy will now take precedence for all in the industry. And with that, I will bring this second part of the Twilight Zone disaster to a close. This was a case where I'm not sure how I felt about the defendants involved. When I see a terrible accident followed by criminal prosecution, it sometimes feels like a double tragedy. But maybe there needed to be some more consequences beyond a slap on the wrist for putting people in harm's way just to get the perfect shot ahead of taking all the right precautions. This case can really get to you. Maybe it was the gruesomeness of the accident, or the fact that it was all caught on video. Or maybe it's more impactful because young children's lives were lost. Or maybe it was the behavior of the director after the fact. Aside from all of that, the fact is that children died while Landis was violating child labor laws, and that kind of takes it to another level of culpability for me. I mean, those child labor laws are in place for a reason, right? To protect children. He purposely went around those laws. He knowingly thumbed his nose at the rules. And they were paid under the table. They were hidden from the fire safety crews. And the parents weren't told the truth about what their children would be involved in. If Landis had been within the law, if he had been more honest about what he was doing, those children would be alive today because they would have never been allowed on that set. Thank you so much for joining me on this 23rd episode of California Dreaming. If you enjoyed the show and would like to discuss any aspects of this story, please feel free to join the Facebook discussion group. And while you're there, also like the California Dreaming Facebook page. And if you would be so kind as to leave a review there or on iTunes, that would be much appreciated. If you would like more information about getting any show stickers, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to send some out to you. The email is KiliforniaPod, that's KILLAFORNIAPOD @yahoo.com. California Dreaming is now proudly a part of the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We are a small but growing family of amazing podcasts across a number of genres. Shows like The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Super Nerds UK, The Dirty Bits Podcast, Historium, Is This Adulting, and Film Roast. You can find all of us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Also there, you can find the link to the TeePublic Orbital Jigsaw merchandise store, where you can get that California Dreaming hoodie or coffee mug that you've been dying to get your hands on. I've seen a couple of listeners post the things that they've purchased on TeePublic, and it's not just me buying stuff for my family and friends, okay? So don't forget to check that out. I will post a link in the show notes and on social media as always. I also need to give a big, huge thank you to everyone who has become a Patreon supporter of California Dreaming. I am slowly but surely growing the show, and I am working towards bringing more perks for those who jump in on any level. Everyone gets access to exclusive content, including original bonus episodes and, like this, early releases. Anytime I have a multi-part series, I will always try to get the second parts up early. I've also got stickers and I've got refrigerator magnets. And if you for some reason have pledged support and you have not received a card in the mail from me, please email me and let me know, and I will fix that immediately. I also have a whole bunch of Twitter shout-outs from when I asked you guys to like, comment, quote, retweet, GIF, whatever I asked you guys to do. And so many of you responded, so let me try to make sure I get all of you. Big shout outs to the Historium Podcast, my pod brother, Mary, The Real Mike G, Lauren Bessie, McCashin Nyberg, Mo, Tony Torres, Murder Down Under Podcast, the Mysteries and Urban Legends Podcast, True Crime Sweden Podcast, Hello Life WTF, the Lust Mordia Podcast, UK Chav STU, Chalkboard Castles, Miles and Crawford, the Pod Stuff Podcast, True Crime 204, Can We Cult, Dexter Skyhook, That's Weird Podcast, Greg Hopkins, Heebie Jeebie Babes Podcast, Drinks with Larry, Blood on the Rocks Podcast, Varmints Podcast, Nature vs. Narcissism, Two of a Kind and True Crime, Natan Van Alast, Tiffany Robertson, BS Pod PHX, Tracy Faw, Nikki's Podcast, Sib's Web Series, Idiot Podcast, OTP DX Fan 99, Good Nightmare Podcast, We're All Mad Here, Tiger Storm, Amber Lecter, and of course, the fabulous Cambo of True Crime Island. I think that's all of you who liked, commented, gifted, or retweeted me on Twitter. Thank you all for playing along, and until next time, sweet dreams.